I'll warn you when you're 10 minutes in.
All right, yeah, I'll, thanks. I'm gonna time myself as well. Okay, does this look like, is this visible? Excellent, okay. So thanks so much to Chris and Richie for inviting me, and to Gary, Hagen and Alicia for helping pull this all together. It's been wonderful. Sorry, come on now, PowerPoint. Right, so it was easy to temporarily forget this during the workshop, but there's a whole morphological world outside your window, and it's a world of pain and fear. So a lot of clever people who think about morphology a lot think that I and every single speaker at this workshop are as wrong can be, right? So what I want to address here is how much comfort should broadly syntacticist morphologists like me take from the past couple of days? That is, how reassured should I be after this, that we're on the right track after all? And what I'll say is that there's lots to be encouraged by, but I still think we need late insertion. Okay, so on this slide, I've got a list of often cited challenges to syntactic approaches to morphology. I'm not actually going to talk about this last bullet here. I think there's plenty of work out there separate from this workshop that addresses them. But let's do look at some of the others. And I think we find that they've been addressed pretty nicely at this workshop. So Tom pretty wonderfully illustrated what our side, if I may call it that, has to say about the first of these two bullets on my slide, and more besides. He even addressed Hyman's problem of asymmetric compositionality, that is, when two affix orders are possible, and one of them respects the mirror principle rigidly, but the other one has both mirror respecting and mirror violating interpretations associated with it. One remaining elephant in the room, though, is Scopal metathesis, which I do want to address very, very quickly. So Scopal metathesis is a term that's used originally by Kevin Ryan, I think, for a hypothetical situation in which there are two available orders for a pair of affixes, but the interpretation in each case is the opposite of what you would expect given the mirror principle. And insofar as Scopal metathesis doesn't happen ever, that's a problem for word internal phrasal movement approaches of the type that I've embraced in the past and that Tom embraced here. So, and the reason is this. All you need to assume to get Scopal metathesis in such a theory, just take a case like a pair of apple and cause, right, applicative and causative morphology, assume that each of those attract VP and that neither of them tolerates piping of material other than VP. This will yield V cause apple as the order from a structure like cause apple V, and V apple cause as the order from a structure like apple cause V. So this might be a problem, except that it might not be. So there's this one sort of very, very tantalizing pair of examples in a paper by Jeff Good, which seems to illustrate precisely this. So if you look closely at these examples, when the applicative, which is introducing an instrument here, applies to the embedded event, it appears outside of the causative. And when it attaches to the causing event, it appears inside of the causative. But this does need following up. Good emphasizes that he hasn't got very much data on Lubakusu, and so that needs following up. But it might exist after all, and that would be nice, wouldn't it now? Okay, so that's that. On my third bullet, Hilda's talk addressed it quite beautifully today. So phonologically driven affix order turns out not to be, and that's good news. The final bullet I'm going to address is this term morphome here, which I don't think a single person said throughout the workshop. And the fact that no one said it will probably have annoyed the non-syntacticists in the audience, because morphomes have been a focus on research for non-syntacticists, especially for 26 years now. Now, what is a morphome? It's a unit of form, which is crucial for stating certain morphological generalizations, but which does not correlate with any syntactico-semantic unit or any syntactico-semantic generalization. There are many morphologists who think that there are loads of these all over the place. And if they're right, then that's potentially very problematic for our side, regardless of whether you believe in late insertion or not. But though, perhaps they aren't a real part of the grammar. Perhaps whenever we think we see a morphomic pattern, it's because we've misunderstood the nature of the pieces involved. And yesterday, even though they didn't mention the word morphome, Eva Dekany and Katerina Djogajeva provided us with a successful syntactic analysis of one apparently morphomic pattern. So this is nominalization on the one hand and participles on the other, having the same morphology. They showed it's an illusion, right? What you've got is purely participial morphology being able to occur embedded in various sorts of nominal substructures, right? So that's nice. I am going to talk about why I think we still need late insertion, okay? And this, I'm sort of quaking in my boots here because it means being sort of potentially seen as being slightly cheeky to Richie and Chris, but I'm trying to be helpful. So Kane and Collins would like to replace late insertion with 1, selection in the syntax, and 2, sort of conditioned silence of certain elements in certain circumstances, right? And this is a very interesting idea, and I think it would be awesome if it turned out to work, but I don't think it will. And I'm going to tell you why. So first of all, hats off to Laura for raising this issue in the chat yesterday and today, actually. This has been rendered out of date by today's events. So there are such things as phonologically conditioned split of allomorphy, and we emphatically don't want syntactic selection to be able to target phonological features. So either you generate and filter, which is roughly what Eric Grote was saying just now, I think, or you pick your allomorph cyclically from the most deeply embedded constituent outwards after you've built your structure. Either way, something is happening late. You're either filtering at the end, or you are building things in such a way that you don't get the wrong distribution of allomorphs when you spell them out. Now, unfortunately, it's not. Eric Grote had a great idea that maybe the filter is just phonotactics, but it can't be that simple, because as well as not being always optimizing, there are many cases of this phenomenon where the choice of either one of the 2 allomorphs would still yield a phonotactically valid structure in the language. So that's not going to be enough. We need more to capture this phenomenon. As another example, take this passage from Richie's talk yesterday, which I was a bit puzzled by. So Gallego and Uriagareka 2016 is a special case of the sort of theory that Myler 2018 was pursuing. And I cited it as such, and I believe I was right to, and here's why. Ask yourself when ser gets pronounced as a star, okay? The answer is whenever X incorporates into it, right? How do you know that this incorporation step has happened? Because you've already run your syntactic derivation, right? So this at least implicitly is a late insertion account, right? You have to have built the syntax before you can figure out how you're supposed to pronounce this thing. And again, you could do this with filters, right? You could say, oh, well, if you've done the incorporation step, but you put that together with ser, then, oh, no, you don't want to do that. But either way, you have to be doing something late, I think. I agree with Richie that what I said in 2018 is incompatible with POSMA 1993. But for reasons I discuss in the online appendix to Myler 2018, I'm not bothered about that. Similar issues arise for the account of French depletion in the verb to go. Now ask yourself, how does the know when to be silent and when to be pronounced? How does al know when to be silent and when to be pronounced? The answer is it knows because of something about the tense and aspect and person and number features elsewhere in the structure. But those features will only be combined in an appropriate structure once the syntactic structure has been built. So again, you're going to have to either make these decisions late, right, or filter out the bad results. I also do wonder about this in that I suspect there's maybe some implicit competition lurking in this analysis. So what exactly guarantees that only one out of the, al, and e ever gets spelled out? Once we know the answer to that question, we might find that there's an implicit appeal to competition lurking in the account all along, because on the surface there can be only one, right? What guarantees that? Another thing I want to bring up here is that these ideas of Richie's and of Chris's are very exciting in various ways, but I almost don't know sometimes what to do with them. So when you look at this sort of structure that Richie provided yesterday, and you ask what I would like to be able to do is compare the predictions of this theory with those of existing late insertion based approaches to the locality of suppletion. But I can't do that. Because Richie doesn't tell us what the locality limits on conditioned silence are, right? So how far away from something can you be before it's telling you that you have to be silent is too far away? We don't know. And because we don't know, we can't really compare this to, say, like a Bobolic scheme. It would be exciting if we could do such a comparison, because then we could figure out what the predictions are and compare, we'll figure out who's right. But at the minute, we can't do that because we don't know enough about conditioned silence. A little bit about Chris's talk as well. So for Chris, the second person familiar plural forms in Latin American Spanish are just absent from the lexicon. And the syncretism of second plural with third plural follows from the status of usted as an imposter. Now, I like that second part. I think that's correct. I think usted is an imposter. I'm convinced of that. But the issue I have is partly with 31A, I think. 31A means that the surface absence of second person plural in formal forms doesn't follow from the grammar itself. Now, you can disagree about how much that matters, right? In the theories that Chris is critiquing, it does follow from the grammar because there's a rule that obliterates the relevant features, and so no vocabulary item from anywhere in the language could possibly pick out that feature bundle. On Chris's account, these three second plural things just have to be independently, each of them individually absent, right? So it no longer follows from the grammar itself. Again, maybe that doesn't matter. Maybe that's not a huge misgeneralization, but it's so important to note that the generalizations that are being captured here are not the same. And we should think about that. Another question is, how come usted is the singular usted is interpreted as formal, but ustedes is neutral between formal and familiar, right? So there's an obvious sort of Gricean answer to that question that Chris could appeal to. Right? In the plural, there's no competing familiar pronoun like tú or vos, right? And Chris is nodding, so I take it that he would be fine with embracing that account. But what I'm then left wondering why Chris is okay with competition, so long as it's at the semantics pragmatics interface and not at the morphophonology interface. Yeah. Finally, there's this little piece of the talk, which is designed to worry us, I think, about impoverishment as as a theory in its restrictiveness, and as potentially as a theory of acquisition as well, because kids somehow have to sort all this out and figure out what the rules are and what features are relevant and the ordering. The reason that I'm less worried about this than perhaps I ought to be is that I think natural language phonologies present the exact same issue, right? So you think about like distinctive features and sort of discovering sound alternations, and regardless of whether you're in OT land or in RBP land, I think most phonologists now have reconciled themselves with the fact that you do need at least some ordering of process interaction, even if the processes themselves are implemented via generation and filter like in OT, rather than being the result of rewrite rules. Now, natural language phonologies are indubitably acquired, right, despite this barrier. With that in mind, I don't see what the problem is. And I think actually, since impoverishment is an operation of the PF component, you'd expect it to share properties with phonology proper anyway. Like, for example, violating the no tampering condition, which phonology clearly can do, right? Given that it can insert things and delete things and change distinctive phonological feature values in reaction to phonological rules and so on. So I think we know about the architecture of the grammar, that no tampering and all that, and those constraints cease to hold at some point between syntax and phonology. What I'm suggesting is that impoverishment is on the other side of that line. It's after, whenever that ceases to hold, it's before vocabulary insertion, but after spell out, right? In the sense of shipping something off to the interface. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening. For no reason at all, here's my dog. Right, I'll let,
You're 1 minute early, so excellent.
Oh, good.
Gary.
Yeah, so we're already running over time, and Neil's raised a whole bunch of interesting questions. So I could just like give a bit of a summarizing spiel as I was planning to do. An alternative we could basically pick up the conversation that Neil started, and I could possibly pitch some points which I think are relevant. Because we've put some very specific questions to members of the panel. So I mean, I don't know if Chris or Richie has anything in particular to say to any of the particular points. I would be glad to point out things which I think are relevant. Chris, Richie?
It's a little bit hard for me to responses.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wrote Neil an email asking him to send the slides.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
so that we can post the slides on the website, and also
I'm going to try and put them in the chat here so that for all to see, hopefully.
That would also give me an opportunity to.
Yeah, no, of course, yeah, no, you're quite right.
Think a little bit more about the points he made. Yeah, I would have to really think hard about those kind of things.
I don't know. It's not letting me post things in the chat. I'm not sure
Before
why. I will. I'll email it to you, Chris.
You have to like do the. You can't just press Command and V. You have to do something else. I mean, Richard, do you have any particular points to make? You're muted.
Is Richie here?
Is there?
I was struck by Neil's bringing in phonology toward the end, and combination with Adriana's saying that the natural thing is to take morphology to be like syntax, and it's striking in a way that nobody. I mean, it's not striking because the workshop was on morphology, but it's striking in a way that nobody explicitly jumped from morphology as syntax to phonology as syntax. It seems to me that that's an extremely natural jump to take. Of course, it's not an original jump to take, since that kind of jump was very prominent, I mean, relatively prominent in the 1980s under the rubric of government phonology. And I've made some hyper-speculative suggestions in that direction. I think it's extremely interesting to go back to the work, not necessarily to the details, but to go back to the spirit of government phonology and to try to update it into minimalism and ask what phonology would look like if it really belonged to the language faculty in the same sense in which syntax and phonology do. As far as Neil's more specific points are concerned, I'm sorry I didn't know about his 2018 online appendix. Obviously, I missed that. With respect to the locality of silence, one thing that's clear in syntax is that the silence of a given element could be licensed at various stages of the derivation in various different positions. In some cases, very far from the original position, as in, say, German silent topics. And therefore, his remarks made me realize that in this, if I want to pursue this analysis of Go, of Romance language Go, specifically, of course, I should be looking at, thinking about the questions of how exactly these individual pieces are licensed. But I should also be thinking about the question of whether they have to be licensed in situ. Because it could be, after all, that these pieces of Go move in the morpho syntax, and they get licensed in a way that depends on their movement. However, I don't have any specific idea in mind.
No, I think that's exactly the sort of reasoning that will lead to an interestingly really different way of approaching these things, which will make predictions very, very different from what is coming out of the DM literature right now. Yeah, the idea that if I was understanding you correctly, that you essentially have the possibility of iterative licensing of silence. In a sense, something has moved to a position where it got told to be silent, and then maybe it moves on and it ends up really far away from the thing that told it to be. And then the locality issue, the predictions about locality are the same as whatever it is that whatever locality constraints will hold of those further movements, and that's interesting. That's a interesting alternative kind of view. But obviously, the details are extremely important.
I mean, I don't, in general, I don't know like how to compare particular cases, but in this paper that Richie and I are writing up, we did take a look at some cases of allomorphy and compared the two different theories. So the one theory is the late insertion plus restrictions on vocabulary, contextual restrictions on vocabulary items, and the other theory is contextual restrictions on lexical items plus plus empty elements. And, you know, in certain cases, it's just really clear that, you know, the DM approach makes the wrong prediction syntactically. And that's the case of the English plural, you know. So like in a very large number of DM papers, you know, the claim is that EN and S compete with one another for insertion in a particular slot, but it's possible to show that that's just not true, you know. So I think you really need to like take particular cases and dig into them very, very deeply, you know, in a particular language. And it's really impossible to just take a paradigm. You know, a lot of times, not just DM, but linguistics in general, people will present a paradigm and say, okay, here's how it goes. And you really can't do that, you know, in this framework. I mean, you have to kind of know the whole language before understanding any case of allomorphy or syncretism.
I'm not sure I have that much patience.
Well, I mean, yeah, you can only do it for a few languages, and so, you know, other people can only do it for the languages they study. As for the empty elements, I mean, the hope would be that like whatever you can't like just imagine new locality restrictions. I mean, the idea is that they really have to be locality restrictions of the kind that you normally saw in syntax. So, I mean, that's the challenge. So every time you have an empty element in morphology, it should, in principle, be related to a syntactic locality condition, or, you know, you have to create a syntactic locality condition that you can show as justified. And if you can't do that, then, I mean, so that's really difficult. There's no saying that that's easy, but, you know, in principle, there should be an answer to what the locality conditions are, because they're supposed to be the ones that you get from syntax. I can't, I'm just open Neil's talk now, so I'll try to look for some more points. You know.
So yeah, can I make 2 points? So one is about government phonology and the work that Jean Lowenstein has been doing on morphology, which is very close to the syntactic approaches that we are getting, you know, that we have seen in the workshop. A second question I have is about late insertion. So I have some cases where I decided that late insertion is necessary because you couldn't find, like what Neil is saying, what the correct form is unless you have done the derivation. But I was wondering about other cases like in Korean. So maybe, I don't know if you were thinking about those cases like Neil. I mean, where what you get is you have a number of morphemes and their form is determined by whether the element that it attaches to ends in a consonant. Okay, so like the nominative is going to be E, but if it ends in a vowel, the form is going to be K. And so they don't look kind of phonologically related. And so there always, I think you have the problem. And so there's you know, I mean, many of these forms that Korean has, that the forms just look completely unrelated phonologically. But then there's always the possibility that, you know, the form is really EK or something like that, and you delete something in the phonology. So now we don't know which component, you know, is going to kind of give the solution to these cases. And I think we just don't have that question settled. So you need to have both kind of what the phonology is able to do and motivate that if you have an analysis like that. And, you know, kind of be willing to, you know, kind of try to work that out, whether that has a chance. So if it has a chance, then it could be that it is early insertion, right? So for those cases and not late insertion. So what Chris was saying is the same thing, is that, you know, you really have to go in depth in kind of, you know, all these individual cases and find out that, you know, if there's a different phonological structure, is the structure of the verb different? You know, are there silent elements involved? So yeah, and that becomes really a question about kind of the division of labor of the different components, and especially in morphology, where things are often reduced, silenced, you know, small, and that becomes, you know, kind of a question of whether historical analysis actually are synchronically true or not. And so that just needs, I think, a lot of refined work. And
mean,
I think Jean is actually doing this type of work quite well.
Yeah, let me reiterate what Hilda said. I mean, with E and Ka, the problem with E and Ka is that, like, typically what you'll do is you'll like see it in a morphology paper, or you'll see the paradigm, and then it'll have E and Ka, and then you say, oh, okay, now, you know, that's it. And then you like give the rules, and you let the system run. But, you know, like Hilda said, you know, you really have to go a lot deeper to just understand E and Ka, just like you have to go very deep to understand the difference between E, N, and S for the English plurals. I mean, so we don't, like, what are the properties of E? Does E just appear here? Like, you know, what are the properties of Ka? Like in Japanese, sometimes you have these deletion phenomena where you can delete the DP and leave the case marker. Does that apply to both of them? You know, do they ever appear in other contexts sort of slightly related to case that is not case? I mean, you really, I think to have like an analysis of E and Ka, you'd really have to go quite deep into Korean, you know, to kind of know that. Like, and you really don't see that in a lot of morphology papers. They just have like a paradigm and say, okay, here's how this works, and now let's give the, you know, vocabulary items. And so, yeah, I mean, ultimately it may be that these cases that Laura's talking about or that Neil's talking about might really argue for late insertion, but still, shouldn't we have a null hypothesis that you really have to kind of dig into first before you take such an extreme position? Yeah, that's the idea.
In that spirit, I actually wanted to ask a follow-up question about the EN versus S case, which you mentioned, Chris, in your talk. So I remember that you brought up that case in your paper on merge and the development of merge as an operation, mentioning observations of Ritchie's to the effect that there's a difference in acceptability between the deviant oxens and the even more deviant oxygen. So that was the observation that was made in that paper to support the view that N is inner and S is outer.
Yeah.
And the argument struck me as quite interesting, but it occurred to me that a skeptic who did not want to say that they occupy different positions might try to attribute that precisely to phonological properties of the two affixes. So they might say, well, N has to be immediately preceded by a stressed syllable, as in children, brethren, oxen, whereas S, of course, doesn't have that requirement, so we get alligators. And so I was wondering whether in your analysis of N and S, you have, or EN and S, you have a response to the skeptic who might take that.
Yeah, that evidence is very, that's just surface evidence that's sort of consistent with the argument. I mean, there's much better evidence. There's this paper by Punsky and Jackson, I think, that has this really great idea about compounds that, you know, plurals that are found in compounds are inner plurals, and plurals that aren't found in compounds are outer plurals. And it's just a great idea. Like, you know, you have a small thing in compounds and you can't have the big thing in compounds. Well, for me, you know, ox and cart is very close to perfect. Horse's cart is completely awful. And that's just really clear data that, you know, those two things are different animals. And I think that converges with Ritchie's evidence. The thing about the, you know.
No, it's a really nice response. And also, aren't there varieties of English that allow children's?
Children English, actually.
What was that?
My son says this.
Okay, there we go.
He will also say botted as well, right? So these are the kind of doublings that you get fairly regularly across child Englishes after a stage.
Yeah.
And I feel like, you know, that type of acquisition data, like the errors that kids are making, the non-target material, and particularly the doublings are going to be super important. I had that thought when Neil was talking about the kind of the French verb with all the null elements, and was saying, well, you know, you have to know V is going to be silent when the A is pronounced, or vice versa. And it got me thinking, well, do kids ever pronounce both? Like, do kids ever make these kind of non-target utterances where they put the V in, overgeneralizing? Kids overgeneralize all the time. And, you know, after time, exposure, data, they filter out, right? I mean, the words filter, we talked about filters at various points, which sounded like a kind of cross-derivational sort of proposal, but filter, the way to think about filtering to a great extent, it's just thinking, well, kids disregard the hypothesis because they get no positive evidence for it. They don't retain the idea that you pronounce both together. And it just goes away because they never hear it, but they still go for it because they still have the option in principle. I just feel like the acquisition, you know, Adriana mentioned the acquisition data and various other people did it at various points. I think it's going to be very important to look at more of that and to look at the kinds of non-target morphological doublings in particular that kids do.
I mean, let me make another point about these whole questions that, you know, I think this is really related to the SMT that I brought up at the beginning of my paper, which is that even if you've decided you have a good argument for late insertion, maybe Laura's data will lead us in that direction. You know, that doesn't alleviate having to ask SMT-like questions about everything else. So, you know, everything is a battle, and it's not going to, you're not like going to get the whole system, you know, just because you have late insertion. I mean, you have to kind of like, can you justify impoverishment? I felt Neil's justification of impoverishment is very weak. You know, he's basically taking a system which he's claiming is, you know, everybody admits is unrestricted and saying impoverishment is like that. So let's admit it. You know, to me, that's very unsatisfactory unless he gave.
Wait, no, because that wasn't an argument for impoverishment. It was an argument against impoverishment.
Okay.
Right. So I don't think what I said today isn't why we need impoverishment.
But you're saying that like my arguments against impoverishment don't hold because.
Right. Yeah. Because I think impoverishment is a operation of the morphophonological component. It's part of what happens on the way to translating the output of syntax into something that's pronounced.
I mean, I would have to be convinced that, like, I give a very particular case where, you know, you have an exponentially high number of options, not even including the orderings. I'd have to be convinced that, like, that kind of thing can happen in phonology, and I just don't know enough phonology to be able to comment on that. So it seems very weak to me, like, to say that, you know, something that like a restrictiveness argument doesn't matter because you can find an equally unrestrictive system that it looks like. You know.
But I mean, the thing is that the way I understood the dialectic was that you were drawing attention to, you know, the properties of this system and saying, well, you know, surely nothing like this can exist in natural language. I think it's completely appropriate in response to an argument like that to point to something in natural language that has precisely that property. I don't see why that's a weak argument.
Yeah, but I guess I would have to see like the actual phonological paradigm that looks like that.
Look, I mean, it's just you don't even need to see a phonological paradigm. Like, you just have to think, okay, how many distinctive features, you know, do you need to pick out the full phoneme inventory of English, right? And then how many, just combinatorically, how many deletion and insertion and change operations can you formulate over those features? It's enormous, it's enormous. And the reason why natural language phonologies are acquirable is that there's lots of access to the surface sound alternations, right? You can make the argument that the same is true of paradigms, right? You figure out, Charles figuring out morphological decomposition. It's gonna figure that, you know, these bits that it's identifying correspond to something in the syntactic representations that it's building up. The list of allomorphs that it has to sort of, that exist for any given point in that structure are going to be finite, right? So there's going to be a list of them, and then you just have to figure out how to derive the distribution correctly. I think the problem has exactly the same form as the problem of.
I mean, I guess my if I had enough strength to read morphology, morphology and phonology, I would my response to that would be sort of like Richie's, which would, you know, I would imagine that phonology is a lot more restricted than just that. Like, you know, somebody coming to the ball game isn't going to have an exponentially large number of choices given the mechanisms that they have available to them. Yeah. So, but I just don't have enough time or energy to prove that about phonology.
I mean, it's late on a Saturday. I don't blame you.
Just a small remark on the doubling, follow up. So comparative evidence between languages plays a role. And so there are actually Germanic languages, including my own, I think, that does doubling for plurals throughout the paradigms. And so it's not called like that because, you know, we will say that kinder is not a plural, but there is a kind of selection going on. And you can actually see the two pieces co-occurring. You know, in other cases, Breton and, you know, the other languages that do this regularly, having multiple exponents of a plural. With difference between inner and outer plurals.
Yeah, we're already probably quite a bit over time, right, Hagen? So should we draw proceedings to a close?
Yeah, I think unless there are any more pressing questions.
Yeah,
That
really interesting.
lots of discussions that will continue in various emails and other socially distanced safe.
There's been something popping into the chat while we've been talking that we've just been sort of ignoring. But I guess the chat will be harvested, right? And so these could be distributed to their addressees.
Yeah. Cool.
So, Chris, do you have any last words, or should we just?
Maybe Richie does. Does Richie have anything to tie up?
Well, I think we should just thank everybody who has participated. In particular, I'd like to thank all the people who had the patience to listen to my talk.
Great, and I also really want to thank Alicia, who did a tremendous job with working just flawlessly for everyone. And thanks to everyone who gave one of the many super interesting talks. And thanks to Richie and Chris for organizing this workshop.
Thank you all for coming.